The ocean below looked calm, endless, almost peaceful. But inside the cockpit, time had begun to fracture. At cruising altitude over thousands of miles of open water, the aircraft was doing what it had done hundreds of times before, gliding smoothly through thin air, guided by instruments, mathematics, and trust. Trust in systems, trust in procedures, trust that the fuel beneath the wings would be enough. No mountains, no cities, no emergency runways, just water. And then, a warning light. At first it didn't scream, it didn't panic. It blinked, quietly, politely, like a whisper you ignore because you've heard it before. A minor imbalance, a fuel discrepancy. Something that could be explained later. Something that always is. Except this time, it wasn't. This was the beginning of a chain reaction that aviation textbooks would later dissect, line by line. A moment that would be replayed in simulators. A flight that would be remembered not because it crashed, but because it should have. This plane was running out of fuel, and it was already too late to turn back. The most dangerous place to lose fuel. When people imagine aviation disasters, they picture storms, explosions, or dramatic mechanical failures. But the most dangerous emergencies are often silent, invisible, mathematical. Fuel exhaustion is not sudden. It doesn't announce itself with fire. It creeps. Over the ocean, fuel is life. Every kilogram is calculated before departure. Wind forecasts, alternate airports, contingency reserves. Aviation is built on margins, thin ones. But margins disappear faster than pilots expect when assumptions are wrong. On this flight, the aircraft had departed normally. No delays, no storms ahead, no red flags. Just a long, transatlantic journey with passengers asleep, movies playing, coffee being poured in the cabin. Up front, the cockpit instruments told a reassuring story. Fuel quantity looked acceptable. Engine performance was normal. Autopilot held altitude perfectly. But behind those numbers, something wasn't adding up. The fuel in one tank was draining faster than expected. Not fast enough to alarm immediately, just fast enough to be ignored. The human factor. Aviation does not fail because of one mistake. It fails because small errors line up perfectly. The crew noticed the imbalance. They followed procedure. They cross-fed fuel. They assumed a sensor issue. Because most of the time it is. Modern aircraft generate hundreds of messages. If pilots reacted dramatically to every anomaly, planes would never reach their destinations. Experience teaches restraint. And that experience whispered, "This is manageable." But there was a flaw no checklist could reveal immediately. Fuel wasn't just moving incorrectly. It was leaving the aircraft. Somewhere in the wing, a tiny failure, almost insignificant on its own, was bleeding fuel into the void. No spray visible from the cockpit, no smell, no vibration, just loss, kilogram by kilogram, minute by minute. The ocean waited below, indifferent. When numbers start lying, fuel calculations in flight rely on two truths: what the sensors report, what the engines consume. When those two disagree, pilots compare trends. But trends take time to reveal themselves, and time was the one resource this flight didn't have. The aircraft continued forward, deeper into the point of no return. Over the Atlantic, there was a line pilots fear silently: the equal time point. Past this point, turning back takes longer than going forward. They crossed it, unknowingly. Now, every minute of delay locked the aircraft farther from safety. The first engine flame out. It happened without drama. No explosion, no fireball, just silence. One engine spooled down, its roar fading into a hollow wind noise that no jet pilot ever wants to hear. The aircraft yawed slightly. Autopilot compensated. Inside the cabin, most passengers didn't notice. Inside the cockpit, the air changed instantly, because losing one engine over land is a serious emergency. Losing one engine over the ocean with unknown fuel status is something else entirely. The crew moved fast now. Procedures shifted, voices sharpened, calculations became urgent. They still had one engine, but fuel doesn't disappear politely. It takes everything. The realization. No pilot wants. As they ran the numbers again, the truth emerged. Not as panic, but as certainty. The remaining fuel wasn't enough. Not for their destination. Not for their planned alternate. Not with the margin aviation demands. Every option on the map was water. And then, the second engine coughed. Complete power loss. At cruising altitude, at over 30,000 feet, both engines went silent. The aircraft did not fall. It glided. Commercial jets are not bricks. They are engineered to fly even without thrust. But glide is a temporary gift, one that trades altitude for time. At that altitude, the crew had roughly 20 minutes. 20 minutes to find land, calculate glide distance, configure systems manually, prepare hundreds of passengers for an outcome. No airline ever trains for publicly. No engines, no thrust. Limited electrics, just airflow and gravity. The ocean below was no longer abstract. It was approaching. Passengers still didn't know. This is the part people rarely understand. Inside the cabin, there was no screaming, no chaos, no sudden announcement. The aircraft was eerily smooth. Flight attendants continued walking the aisles, trained to remain calm, even when the cockpit is fighting physics itself. Because panic spreads faster than fire, and because hope, however thin, still existed. A decision that would define everything with power gone. The crew had one remaining miracle: altitude. They began searching, not for perfection, but for anything. An island, a military base, a runway not meant for jets. The navigation display showed a faint possibility. A place few passengers had ever heard of. A strip of land, barely long enough. A descent path that allowed zero mistakes. They turned toward it. No engines, no go-around. One attempt. If they missed, there would be no second chance. The engines were dead. But the aircraft was still flying. At over 30,000 feet, silence filled the cockpit in a way no simulator can truly prepare you for. The constant vibration, the heartbeat of jet engines, was gone. What remained was the sound of wind sliding across aluminum, a hollow rush that reminded the crew of one brutal truth. This plane was no longer powered. It was borrowed time. Every foot of altitude was now a currency. And it was being spent rapidly. When a jet becomes a glider, commercial airliners are not designed to fall from the sky. They are designed to fly, even without engines. At this altitude, the aircraft had roughly a 15-20.1 glide ratio. That meant for every mile forward, it lost hundreds of feet. That sounds generous. It isn't. Because glide is not just distance. It is precision. Too fast and altitude is wasted. Too slow, and the aircraft stalls. With no thrust, there is no correction, no recovery, no second attempt. The captain disengaged autopilot. From this moment on, human hands controlled everything. Dark cockpit. As the engines died, so did most electrical systems. The cockpit dimmed, screens blinked off, non-essential systems vanished. The aircraft reverted to emergency power, driven by a small turbine spinning in the airflow, the ram air turbine. It provided just enough electricity to keep critical instruments alive. Just enough. No comfort, no redundancy, no margin. Checklist discipline now mattered more than instinct. The crew ran procedures they had memorized, but hoped would never need. Fuel? Zero. Engines? Inoperative. Restart? Impossible. This was no longer about saving the aircraft. It was about finding ground. A runway that shouldn't work on the navigation display. One option remained. A remote island. An airstrip never meant for wide-body jets. No commercial traffic, no safety nets. The runway was short, narrow, surrounded by cliffs and ocean. It was originally built for military use decades earlier, long forgotten by most maps. But forgotten did not mean impossible. At this glide angle, they could just reach it. Barely, no go around. In normal aviation, every landing has an escape plan. This one didn't. With engines out, once the aircraft committed to final approach, there was no climbing away. No correcting a bad angle. No second chance. If they were high, they would overshoot into the sea. If they were low, they would come up short. This was a one-shot landing, with hundreds of lives on board. The captain made a decision few pilots ever face. Land fast, not smooth, because a hard landing on land is survivable. A perfect glide into the ocean is not. The cabin feels it now. Passengers began to sense something was wrong, not through alarms but through feel. The engine's hum was gone. The descent felt steeper. The air was quieter. Flight attendants secured the cabin with practiced calm. Voices steady. Instructions clear. No explanations. No panic. Because fear, once unleashed, cannot be controlled. Inside the cockpit, the crew chose honesty with each other, and silence for everyone else. Speed is life. With no thrust, airspeed became sacred. Too much speed meant overshooting the runway. Too little meant a stall, and a stall at low altitude is unforgiving. The pilots adjusted pitch with microscopic inputs, trim, rudder. Flaps deployed only when absolutely necessary. Every decision was delayed as long as possible. Every second of altitude mattered. The most dangerous part, final approach. As the runway came into view, a new danger emerged. The glide path was too high. Normally, pilots would add power, adjust descent, stabilize the approach. There was no power, so they did the unthinkable. They side-slipped the aircraft, tilting it slightly sideways into the wind to increase drag and bleed altitude rapidly. This maneuver is rarely used in large jets, but desperation rewrites rules. The aircraft descended faster now, faster than anyone wanted. The runway rushed closer. Touchdown or death. There was no flair for comfort. The wheels hit hard. So hard that tires exploded. So hard that the aircraft bounced, but stayed on the ground. Brakes slammed on. Reverse thrust was useless. There were no engines. The aircraft screamed forward, burning rubber, runway disappearing fast. At the very end, the plane stopped. Meters before the ocean, silence returned. This time not from failure, but from survival. Only then did the passengers know applause didn't erupt immediately. People didn't scream. They sat, stunned, processing the impossible. They had just landed a powerless jet on a forgotten runway in the middle of the ocean. Something aviation history said should not happen, but it did. The aircraft was safe. The passengers were alive. But aviation does not celebrate survival without answers. Because in this industry, almost is unacceptable. Within hours of the landing, investigators began reconstructing the flight. Not emotionally, but mathematically. Every kilogram of fuel, every switch position, every assumption made in the cockpit. And what they uncovered was more unsettling than a dramatic explosion or a single catastrophic error. This aircraft did not lose fuel suddenly. It bled out slowly. The myth of running out of fuel. When the public hears ran out of fuel, they imagine negligence, forgetfulness, a basic mistake. Aviation fuel exhaustion is rarely simple. This flight did not depart empty. It did not ignore minimums. It did not violate dispatch rules. On paper, everything was correct. Which is why this incident terrified experts. Because if it could happen here, it could happen anywhere. A leak you couldn't see, deep inside the wing, hidden from sight, was a failure no passenger could detect and no pilot could visually confirm. A small but critical component, part of the fuel line assembly, had been compromised. Not shattered, not ruptured violently, just enough to leak, not a stream. A continuous loss. Fuel escaped into the airflow, atomizing instantly, leaving no trail. At altitude, the cold masked it further. No odor reached the cabin. No mist was visible from the cockpit. The aircraft was flying perfectly, while silently emptying itself. Why the warning didn't save them? Modern aircraft don't simply show fuel remaining. They show calculated fuel based on what sensors detect, what engines consume, what computers expect the problem. When fuel leaks before reaching the engine, consumption looks normal. The engines weren't burning extra fuel. They were burning exactly what they were supposed to. The missing fuel never reached them. So the computers trusted the math, and the pilots trusted the computers. The false comfort of experience. The crew noticed the imbalance early. This is where human psychology enters. Fuel imbalance warnings are common. Sensors drift. Valves stick. Crossfeed corrects it. Crews see this hundreds of times across careers. So they did what experience taught them to do. They managed it. They assumed a sensor issue, not a structural leak, because leaks are rare. Because leaks usually come with other signs. Because the aircraft wasn't acting sick. And aviation teaches pilots not to panic over ghosts. This time, the ghost was real. A decision that sealed the outcome. Here lies the most controversial moment. When imbalance increased, the crew opened the crossfeed, allowing fuel to equalize between tanks. It made sense, but unknowingly, it fed the leak. Instead of isolating the problem, the system allowed fuel from the healthy tank to drain into the failing side, and then out of the aircraft. From that moment, the countdown accelerated. Not because the crew was careless, but because the system did exactly what it was designed to do. The point of no return. Unseen investigators later determined the exact minute the flight crossed into inevitability. At that moment, remaining fuel was below required reserve. No nearby alternate was reachable. Engines would flame out regardless of crew action. The aircraft was already doomed to lose power. The pilots just didn't know it yet. That's what makes this incident so chilling. The decision that mattered most was made without anyone realizing its consequences. Why this incident changed aviation. After the investigation, the industry reacted, not with blame, but with redesign. Procedures changed. Fuel imbalance now triggers leak suspicion earlier. Crossfeed logic is taught differently. Crews are trained to assume the worst sooner. Monitoring now focuses on trend discrepancies, not single readings. This incident rewrote training manuals worldwide. Not because someone failed, but because the system allowed failure to hide. The passengers never knew the full story. Most passengers went home thinking they'd experienced a miracle. They were right. But the real miracle wasn't the landing. It was that human skill overcame invisible failure. That when technology went blind, training still worked. No alarms were screaming now. No procedures left to run. No systems left to save. What remained was human judgment, stripped bare. Inside the cockpit, the world had narrowed to a few instruments. A fading altitude tape and a strip of land ahead that represented the only line between survival and the sea. This is the part of the story that never appears in checklists. Because this is not about technology. It's about the human mind under impossible pressure. When training ends and instinct begins, pilots train for emergencies constantly. Engine failures, electrical failures, fire, decompression. But total power loss over the ocean is different, because there is no recovery path. No simulated reset. The crew knew this landing would define everything they had ever learned. Years of training condensed into minutes. The captain spoke less now. Not because of fear, but because clarity demands silence. Every unnecessary word steals focus. The first officer handled calculations, eyes moving rapidly between speed, altitude, and glide path. There was no panic, Panic wastes time. The weight of lives. You cannot see behind the cockpit door sat hundreds of passengers, families, children, people who trusted strangers in uniforms with their existence. The crew did not think of them individually. They couldn't. Pilots are trained to think in systems, not faces, because faces break concentration. But the weight of those lives was present in every control input. Every small correction carried consequence. Too shallow, and they'd overshoot into the ocean. Too steep, and they'd lose control. This was not fear. This was responsibility. Choosing a hard landing. One of the most difficult mental shifts a pilot must make is accepting damage. Normally, pilots protect the aircraft. In this moment, they sacrificed it. They chose to land fast. They accepted blown tires, structural stress, possible injuries. Because smoothness was irrelevant, survivability was everything. This is a decision no simulator teaches emotionally. You must decide to break the airplane to save the people. The most dangerous moment. Commitment. As they turned onto final approach, the runway filled the windshield. At that instant, there was no going back. The captain knew. If this approach failed, the aircraft would not fly again. This is where many accidents happen, when doubt leads to hesitation. But hesitation kills glide. So the captain committed. Hands steady, inputs precise, eyes locked forward, no second guessing. Why they didn't tell the passengers. People often ask this. Why not warn them? Why not prepare them emotionally? Because fear spreads faster than information. Because panic in the cabin could destabilize evacuation, injure people, or distract the crew. Because calm is a survival tool. Flight attendants were trained to read cues from the cockpit, and they sensed the gravity without being told details. Their professionalism mattered as much as the pilot's skill. After touchdown, the release. When the aircraft stopped, meters from the ocean, there was no celebration, just stillness. Only then did the captain feel it. The adrenaline drained, hands trembled slightly, breathing slowed. Not relief, exhaustion. Because holding control while suppressing fear is the most demanding thing a human mind can do. The words spoken after landing. The cockpit voice recorder captured something unexpected. No shouting, no cheers, just quiet confirmation. The job was done. That restraint is why pilots are trusted with lives, why this crew became a benchmark. Aviation does not reward luck. It rewards decision quality under pressure. This crew made no heroic speeches, no dramatic gestures. They followed fundamentals. Fly the airplane, manage energy. Commit decisively. The aircraft was silent on the runway. Engines dead, tires shredded, metal scarred. But every passenger was alive. In aviation, that alone is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of accountability. Because survival does not erase questions. It magnifies them. The investigation begins. Within hours, investigators arrived, not to celebrate, but to dissect. The aircraft was grounded where it stopped. Fuel tanks were measured. Valves were examined. Data recorders were recovered. Every second of the flight would be replayed. Not to assign blame, but to understand how a modern jet could glide powerless across an ocean and survive. What they found would ripple across global aviation. The crew under the microscope. Contrary to public myth, pilots involved in incidents are not immediately praised. They are scrutinized. Every decision is questioned. Why wasn't the leak identified earlier? Why was crossfeed opened? Why wasn't a diversion made sooner? But investigation is not courtroom drama. It is engineering logic, and the conclusion was clear. The crew followed existing procedures. Those procedures simply weren't designed for this kind of failure. That realization mattered more than any medal. Systems were trusted and failed silently. The aircraft's systems did not lie. They told the truth they were programmed to see. The problem was what they could not see. Fuel lost before reaching engines creates a blind spot, one that training at the time did not emphasize strongly enough. This flight exposed that blind spot, and aviation listens when blind spots are revealed. Changes that came after. This incident rewrote training manuals worldwide. New doctrines were introduced. Fuel imbalance, where possible leak until proven otherwise. Earlier isolation of tanks. Stronger emphasis on trend monitoring. Simulator scenarios now include silent fuel loss. Crew resource management reinforced decision cross-checking. Airlines updated procedures. Manufacturers revised guidance. Regulators amended oversight. Not because of failure, but because of survival. The crew's legacy. The pilots did not become celebrities. They returned to flying after evaluation and retraining. But in simulators around the world, their decisions live on. Instructors say, "Remember this case." Because their calm, discipline, and commitment became the benchmark for how professionals behave when the sky removes every advantage. They proved something aviation believes deeply. Skill is not loud. It is precise. What passengers remember. Years later, passengers would describe the landing in simple terms. Hard, unexpected, quiet. Many never knew how close they came to the ocean. That is the highest compliment to a flight crew. When passengers don't realize how bad it was, it means the crew did everything right. Why this story still matters: because aviation continues to push limits. Longer routes, more automation, fewer margins. This story reminds us that technology is powerful, but incomplete. Procedures matter, but must evolve. Human judgment remains irreplaceable. When systems fail quietly, humans must notice loudly. The final truth. This plane did not survive because of luck. It survived because pilots trusted fundamentals. Crew stayed disciplined. Training overcame surprise. And because someone, somewhere, built a runway that no one thought they'd need. Those principles saved everyone on board.